Hello and welcome to the CX Files for the 14th of July 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan, based in Montreal, Quebec usually. However, today I'm in New York City, Mark, just on a little R&R and visiting my friends, the New York Yankees.
That's cool. Well, maybe not so much going to see the Yankees, come on.
Well, I have to admit I'm a baseball fan, and the pandemic really sapped the life out of me, not being able to see any ball games live. So it's nice to be in New York and being able to catch some sun and hopefully some fly balls too.
I haven't been to see any baseball since 2019 because obviously because of the pandemic, it's very difficult to travel. But the last game I saw in 19 was the Chicago Cubs. And I think it was the beginning of May. So it was early in the season. And I kind of assumed that, it would be a nice sunny summer's day in Chicago. But actually the most popular item that everyone was buying at the game was blankets.
It's funny how that happens. Well, I mean, obviously the changing climate is not giving baseball any respite. And it's interesting because we're going to be talking a little bit about the climate and environment today in our discussion that you had with Neo Group.
Yep, absolutely. So I talked with Hemant Puthli, who's the managing director and partner at Neo Group. He's based out in Mumbai in India. And we had a conversation about ESG and outsourcing and why does it matter and why do the BPOs need to take notice. Now, Hemant's team, they've just put out a report on ESG where they actually talked to about 20 different IT and BPO companies, and they tried gauging, are they really taking ESG seriously, or are they just greenwashing? And it's worth mentioning, just listeners might well be familiar with CSR, corporate social responsibility, but ESG is a sort of a broader measure. It actually looks at the environment, the kind of social aspects of the company, but also the governance. So how is the company run as well? And so, I think that his research is quite interesting because it really takes a look at a lot of the companies that we all know and love in this industry. And we do see them put on their website and their annual reports, all these nice, tree planting initiatives and stuff like that. But his team really dug deep to find out, are they really changing culturally?
But I think that you're raising a couple of interesting points here, Mark. And again, I think it's worthwhile for our listenership to take into account that CSR is something that we've been talking about for years, but it's become almost, I think, a bit of a cliche. ESG goes a level deeper, and companies that are really doing ESG properly are the ones that are making some structural differences into how their businesses are run. And to be perfectly blunt, the most recent iteration of the 2022 Ryan Strategic Advisory Front Office CX Omnibus Survey shows that the buying community is expecting that their BPO partners are going to be implementing ESG. They want to see a level of commitment to the environment, to social causes, to diversity, and they want to understand as well that there's actually governance in place to make sure that these initiatives are being followed through on, and that they're being implemented in such a fashion that's going to make a concrete difference. So I'm really looking forward to the chat today that you undertook. And to my mind, it's going to be very salient as we move into the second half of this year.
And I think that what's really changed in the last year or couple of years is we've moved on from that idea of greenwashing being acceptable. It's no longer just around marketing and making the company look good because you're a good corporate citizen or something like that. We're now seeing that in this case, for example, the companies that are hiring an outsourcing partner want to see what your ESG credentials really are. It's part of the RFP nowadays. So if you're in this industry and you're a BPO, you need to demonstrate that you've got those kind of credentials, because otherwise you're going to start missing out on some big contracts. But
it's happening already.
Yeah, we're seeing it right now. And it's funny because this is why the Neo Group team actually put this research together, because they found that they were constantly getting companies calling up and saying, hey, Neo Group, you're always talking to different BPOs. Which are the ones that are really doing this and which ones are just kind of greenwashing? And so they were kind of informally giving reports back to different companies. But then in the end, they thought, well, why don't we just put this together into a report? Let's systematically go through all of the BPOs and the big IT companies and work out what's the reality. But I think that, beyond the RFP process, employees are now focused on this. People are thinking like, do I want to join this company? What effect does this company have on the environment, on the on society around the organization, and investors as well. Investors, if you're looking to get investment into your company, they will look to you to see what your ESG strategy is. So I think that we've moved on from this idea of it just being a sort of a nice thing to do, and it's now actually becoming really critical if you want to do business.
It's not a nice to have, it's a structural part about how a business has to run if you're an outsourcer, whether it's BPO, whether it's IT. And those laggards, those Luddite organizations that are not implementing ESG need to get on board fast. But enough talk from us. Let's go straight to the interview and find out a little bit more about what the research from Neo Group is showing.
Okay, Hemant, it's great to get you on the podcast. I think that the first thing to do is maybe to define ESG before we sort of dive into the conversation. A lot of people will have heard of corporate social responsibility, but has this evolved into ESG then?
Well, Mark, thank you for having me on this podcast, and it's really nice to connect with you again. So yes, it's interesting. The genesis of ESG. I mean, people have been doing ESG kind of things for long before there was a 3-letter acronym. An idea, whose time has come, it has matured when it gets a TLA, which is a 3-letter acronym. So now ESG is kind of here. I think the last, 5 or 10 years ago, I don't know exactly who coined it and when, but it gained significant traction. But before that, it kind of was forming in different, different businesses all over the world in different ways. Right from the, if you go back in time in the US or in the Western world, from the time of industrialization, post-industrialization, there has been a culture of giving back to the society, to the communities that businesses are founded in. Even the robber barons in the United States, they did all kinds of business, practices that we should not go into ideally. But they started schools and hospitals and colleges and, there's so many places, institutions named after all the Rockefellers and the Carnegies of the world. Very similar thing, happened in India. There was the Tata Group, a great industrialist, built a lot of industry for India. Then the Birlas and the Goenkas, etc. And they're all famous for having built schools and hospitals and colleges. So it's been around in different forms for a very long time. But it's only in the last few years, I think it was around the time in the 80s that the United Nations defined sustainable development as a thing. It became a thing. It was given a name. And they said that development is great and the underdeveloped and developing countries need to develop, but it has to be a sustainable form of development. It cannot be a destructive form of development. And these so-called underdeveloped and developing countries, their problem always has been to the West. You guys got to pollute and you're not letting us, do the same thing. Now, when it comes to our turn to grow, you're not allowing us to do that. So there has been this asymmetry to some extent, but anyway, that's at the international level. We are more interested in the implications on the business side. And the general belief is that, governments can do their thing, but it's really up to corporations to, if you like, if I may stretch it a little bit, save the world, to actually go out there and do something about climate change, do something about social inequality, do something about the eroded trust in institutions, in businesses. That which happened, was accentuated in the 2008 financial, crash of pretty much the world economy, if you like. Institutions that were 100 years old just overnight disappeared. That kind of thing has never happened. A lot of things have happened in the last 10 to 15 years that had never happened before. Be it on the natural calamities and catastrophe side, or on the economic side, or even in the social and political, map of the world, the Arab Spring, all of those things. So there has been a history to it, and it has three components: the E, the S, and the G, and that has come together. Sustainable development, for as far as businesses are concerned, is basically being called ESG. It's pretty much the same thing, but we love having TLAs, like I said earlier, and that's the TLA we're going with. So it's basically sustainability, the concept, the philosophy adopted by business, and it manifests as, an environmental component, a social component, and a governance component.
Okay. No, that's a great introduction. And I think that, personally, when I think about the evolution, it's like CSR was kind of focused on the social element, but now we're looking at environmental sustainability, society, and where does the company fit? And, is it a good corporate neighbor? And then corporate governance. So, how is the company itself managed? Now, I know that you did a survey on this. So you did some primary research with Neo Group, and you talked to a lot of companies. I think it was just BPO companies, wasn't it? Or like service companies. Yeah.
Yeah. So Neo Group is in the sourcing space. So, the people we know in our world are essentially buyers of outsourced services and providers of outsourced services. So this was aimed at the providers. Well, the buyers all are in different industries, but we wanted to focus on a specific industry. So we picked the sourcing industry, which is providers of IT and business services. Our focus, I must say, has leaned more heavily on the IT side, and a lot of them are also BPO providers, but they're kind of, we didn't do pure play BPOs, for example, not for any specific reason, but it just turned out that.
Okay. Was there a reason to kick off the research project? And,
yes.
And maybe just summarize how you went about that.
Yes. So this was inspired by, over a period of time, clients asking us, hey, do you guys know what suppliers my incumbent is doing, company X or Y, whoever the incumbent was. I see their annual reports. I see they're doing a lot of stuff in ESG. Is this real? Or do they say what they do and do what they say? Or is this greenwashing? Is it because greenwashing is also something a lot of companies are doing. Just take everything that you have as it is, bolt on a few things, which basically looks like compliance. And then boom, you're an ESG sustainable enterprise. So they kept asking us these questions. So, among us partners in Neo, we compared notes one day and we said like, hey, you know what? I've been asked the same questions too. So we said, why don't we get together and put together a list of questions and a kind of a template for assessment and take that out so that when we express our opinions to clients, it's not just what Hemant sees in the market or something like that. It's just a fact-based, objective assessment of what is actually going on with the supply side, and what companies are doing, and how far they have come along in the journey towards transformation, to a sustainable enterprise. So that's essentially what inspired this survey.
Okay, that's great. That's a good introduction. And, and you talked about how, clients are endlessly sort of calling and saying, are these service companies actually following ESG guidelines, or is it just greenwashing? And I think that's interesting because just recently I saw Elon Musk on Twitter and he said ESG ratings make no sense. And of course it got a lot of visibility because I think he has about 100 million followers, but he was responding to an analyst that said Tesla doesn't have a very good rating. So, is it possible to be in an area like creating electric vehicles, which you would think naturally should be very ESG friendly and very green, but you fall down on other measures then?
That is distinctly possible. And I won't get into commenting on Elon Musk. In my view, he's pretty much the enfant terrible of the technology industry. He's pretty much, he's done so many controversial things, said so many controversial things. So I'll leave that alone. I'll give it a white bird. Maybe that's a good subject for another conversation altogether. But for now, it is distinctly possible for a company to kind of get deeply into one aspect of ESG and ignore the others. And one of the things our survey did was to look at the intersectionality, if you will, and the need for a holistic approach. And the intersectionality is I'm applying that term. It comes from another aspect of social justice, which is, feminists use that word quite often when they talk about, the intersection of race and gender issues and all of those things. Just like in that world, or in our world, actually, it's not a different world, but just like, when you look at things from that perspective, it is possible theoretically and practically as well, to be a staunch feminist and still be a bit of a racist at heart, or vice versa, or kind of still have a different set of prejudices. But if you really follow in principle the philosophy of social justice, then you should not have any prejudices at all, whether it's based on gender or race or ethnicity or nationality or social status or income group or whatever it is. You should not have any, predisposed feeling towards a group or a community of people by virtue of their being different from you vis-a-vis factor X or Y. That's the basic principle. The same thing applies here. And that's why I'm applying the concept of intersectionality here, because it's very similar. I mean, if you're really keen on saving the planet from an environment perspective, you cannot ignore, and you definitely cannot go against, do no harm in, on the S side or on the G side,
Yeah.
That's the first principle, right? I mean, when you set out to fix something, make sure you don't do any harm with respect to other things. So that's, it is possible, and companies are doing it. And B, they should not be doing it. They should be conscious of it. They should look at it from a holistic perspective, and they should look at where these things intersect and take a view. In our survey, the bearing it has on our survey is that we inquired about the way our participants had organized themselves around ESG. Do they have discrete, fragmented approach or decentralized approach? Fragmented is probably a negative connotation. Decentralized approach, which is somebody handling E, somebody handling S, somebody handling G, or do they have a single person who looks at all of those things? So, and that again, the report has some commentary about that.
Yeah, I think that intersectionality point is very interesting because clearly, I think a decade ago, just before the financial crash, so maybe a little bit more than a decade ago, there was a real wave of greenwashing, and you could have a company that's awfully run, maybe extremely hierarchical. The lower tiers of the team are not really looked after at all, and yet they presented this image of themselves as hugging polar bears and all of this kind of stuff. And what you're saying is that you can't just be good only in one area and still get a very good ESG rating.
Yes. I think, the world is kind of, the ESG world is far more mature today. And people see that. And people see that, are you embracing it in spirit as well as letter, or just, trying to comply with some norms, some guidelines, some standards, and then say, hey, we're a green company.
Yeah. And what were the sort of results from your survey then? I mean, how did you see the general adoption of ESG measures in the service companies that you were talking to?
Yes, in fact, that's a nice segue into the heart of our survey, which, unlike a lot of other surveys, actually, I have not come across a survey of this type that anybody has done, at least now in today's date and age, for IT and BP service providers, and getting into both the what we call the operational performative issues as well as the cultural attitudinal issues. So we plotted basically these two sets of criteria on two different axes, and we have a 2D grid, an X and Y axes. So on the X-axis, we have, where a company it can be mapped on operational performative criteria, and that basically means, which how far have you come along in implementing ISO 26000, for example? That's one of the questions, and companies have assessed themselves, saying that, only just begun, or we're well on the way, or we've kind of achieved a lot and we are kind of pretty close to steady state or something like that. That's a self-assessment, and that's on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, our entire process, we see ourselves as a stakeholder because we are, if you look at a company, the four primary stakeholders of a company, we see it as a series of concentric circles. So the first circle around a company is, has four what we call primary stakeholders: investors and shareholders, who basically fund the company; customers who buy from the company; employees who work for the company; and suppliers and partners who provide the input, the raw material, or just assist and support the company's functioning in delivering those goods to those customers and getting revenue and making a profit, which they pass on to shareholders. So that's the first ring, if you like. And basically, we see ourselves as, we have a stake in there because we represent customers of these companies. All the companies we interview, we have at some point or the other launched an RFP on behalf of our client, representing our client and speaking to them with adopting the face of our client to invite them for an RFP, right? At some stage or the other, all of them. And therefore, we see ourselves as proxy clients in a way, and therefore stakeholders in the first. So we said, how do you respond to a stakeholder is actually, this is a dipstick. This is kind of like a test. This whole process of conducting this survey and this interview is a process. So on the y-axis, we plotted how we saw them as primaries. We are also, industry watchers and analysts. That's the second ring, if you like. Media, industry associations, regulators, host communities, etc. The second ring of secondary stakeholders. So we are also there because we do research, we keep tracking companies, we observe what they're doing, and we comment on innovations and what's new and exciting with all of them. So we have a stake in multiple ways in this industry. So we said how we experience them is basically, if I may coin the word SX, like you have customer experience, user experience, UX, you have customer experience, CX, your podcast is called CX. I think it means the same thing. I hope it does. And absolutely. So we call this SX, the stakeholder experience. And we use ourselves as a litmus test. And, how responsive these companies were, how engaged they were, how diligent they were, how transparent they were, and what kind of passion was visible when we interacted with them in the whole process of conducting the survey and conducting the interview that went along with the survey, is what we, between the 3 or 4 of us conducting the survey, we assessed them on that score. We just kept it objective and neutral, and we kind of brainstormed extensively to kind of rate each of the participants on the y-axis. And that's a very interesting grid to look at. It's on almost the last page of the report.
And I assume that going through that process of analyzing all of the stakeholder experience and looking at all of these service companies, you must have noticed some common attributes in the companies that were doing better than others then.
Yes, companies who actually embraced the core values and foundational principles of sustainability. They, in letter and spirit, they were in the top right quadrant, which was basically high on the x-axis. They were operationally and performatively, well aligned with ESG standards, internationally accepted standards and guidelines and metrics. And also, you could see in the way they responded to the entire survey, their responsiveness and their enthusiasm and their willingness to share more information and tell us what they were doing about ESG, etc. You could see from that culture has percolated from the top down into their organizations. Not all of them, and that was the part that was a little, we expected everybody we talked, because we talked to pretty much the top tier, the creme de la creme of that industry, with maybe a few exceptions here or there. We probably didn't speak to some who should have been there. We probably spoke to some who were not really top tier or whatever. But by and large, we covered pretty much the tip of the pyramid in terms of the IT and BPO services industry. And we expected all of them to be in the top right quadrant, but they were not. A lot of them fell out of that quadrant and into lower quadrants because of the y-axis, or some because of the x-axis, calibration, if you like.
Yeah. And actually, I looked at your presentation that summarized the research, and I could see that there were some companies where they get very good operational scores. So it seems like they're delivering for their customers, but it seems that the idea of ESG hasn't percolated into the corporate culture itself. So was that a surprise to see that?
Yes, that's the part I was referring to. And I said, in this industry, we call it the watermelon effect. You probably have come across it because you've been doing a fair amount of work. Out of all the things you do, I think you've done a lot of work in this industry, the sourcing industry, global services industry. And it's colloquially referred to as the watermelon effect. Green on the outside and red in the inside. So typically this happens when customers say, my provider is meeting all their SLAs and their KPIs, and every status meeting I attend, everything was green. But my project directors and project managers are not happy. Why? We don't know. Because every time we introduce a metric, they somehow find a way to meet and exceed, in some cases, our expectations. But somewhere down the line, there is a sense that we're not getting, not really getting what we want or our money is worth. So why does that happen? That happens because the culture and the attitude of the vendor in this case is not that of really providing satisfaction. It's that of checking boxes, and that's a very different approach to doing things. Managing optics rather than providing the content and letting the optics manage themselves. That's the difference. And that's really why you see the watermelon effect. And we were acutely aware of this. And that's the reason why we had the y-axis at all, which is why I was saying it's a very different kind of a survey in that sense. We haven't just gone by, okay, greenhouse gases, what are you doing about it? And how far have you come? And we've done that also. And we've, in that process, we've seen, okay, what does this company look like? The way they talk, the way they, some companies didn't even bother to respond. They didn't even decline. They didn't even come back and say, we are not participating. I'm sorry, we're busy. Any of that would have been fine. Mm-hmm. It's like me calling you 10 times and you're not even picking up my call. Mm-hmm. Literally, in one particular case. It's really sad. And they're a very, very big, large player, and they're doing a lot in this ESG space. It kind of reflects who you really are, as opposed to who you want others to see you as, I think. It's that part was surprising. Yes, it was definitely surprising. And we do not expect to see specific companies doing that. We were quite shocked, actually.
I mean, just finally then on the research, were there any other surprises or maybe highlights that you'd just like to draw out as a sort of summary at the end of the interview then? Yes.
Going back to what I said about the holistic approach, the more mature companies are doing that. I expected to see more of it, but we were a little disappointed. Not so much of a surprise, but more of a disappointment. It's yet to. So if we have a kind of a 3 milestone roadmap for this. So we have the first milestone, or it's not even a milestone. It's really where everybody came from, which is the traditional for-profit enterprise, which is basically built on the Friedman doctrine, if you like, which is thou shalt make money for thine investor and do nothing else. Everything else is a bad word. There is an interview. In fact, it's been published in the New York Times of September 13, 1970. Tom Friedman, not Tom Friedman, Jesus, Milton Friedman. I'm so sorry. And a whole article by him. I can send you that link if you like, and you can maybe extract something from it, which puts actually words like social in quotes as if it's taboo or something, and says And a corporation cannot possibly have any social responsibilities. And people who say this are socialists and blah, blah, blah. It goes on. This is as late as 1970. And barely a couple of decades later, the UN came up with sustainable development as a guiding principle for the world to follow, which completely changed the way corporations started seeing things. It's quaint to read Milton Friedman's article. I'm not saying it was a bad thing, but that was the zeitgeist then. The zeitgeist now is every corporation has, should actually define. So speaking of the three milestones, so that's where corporations have come from historically. So right from the 1600s of the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, all of those. The whole raison d'etre was to actually, create wealth for the people who invested in them. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the principle, the Adam Smith invisible hand, if you like, guiding progress, in whatever way we define it. We have come to define it. Then you have the second stage, which is, like I said, a social responsibility out of a conscience. This is a moral view, saying that I'm making money. Let me use some of that for social good. I owe it to them. So it's a lot of companies, not just the Robert Barons, even many other companies in the IT industry. If you look at the history of Hewlett Packard, for example, they've done. This is one example I know. I respect that company a lot. Historically, 60s, 70s, 80s, they've done so much, for the communities they work with. So corporate citizenship and corporate responsibility is something that companies have always recognized. That's kind of the second stage, but that's still patronage. There is a donor and there's a recipient. The third stage is where patronage becomes partnership, right? So it's kind of instead of giving a man a fish, you teach the man to fish. In fact, you go one step beyond. You work with the man to set up a fishing business, right? So that they can keep their dignity, not feel like they're being at the receiving end of charity or they're, whatever, and earn a living for themselves, be entrepreneurs. So that is the stage where companies are headed. And all the participants we interview and we survey are somewhere between stage 2 and milestone 2 and milestone 3. So they've gone past the first stage of being a purely for-profit, anything we do by way of charity or whatever it is purely discretionary and opportunistic. And hey, by the way, that's good PR. And if you do save, for example, fuel or power, it saves cost. So even those things are driven primarily from a profit kind of thinking. And though it has good, hey, finally, if you're doing good, it doesn't really matter what your intentions were. I get that, and I agree with it. But if you look at their drivers, it came essentially from profitability. Reduce, reuse, recycle, good thing to do, but then it saves cost, and that's why you're doing it.
Yeah,
and not because it's a good thing for the planet, which is what you should be doing it for, and so on. So from there, we've come here. We have come a long way, but there's a lot of distance yet to be covered. So I'm just optimistic and hoping that we will see a convergence, of profit-oriented businesses defining their existence by way of purpose. So from profit first to purpose first and then profit. Mm-hmm. That's the jump. That's a tipping point, if you like. That's the point at which an organization has really transformed.
How do you convince? If you take your survey into a meeting with a hard-nosed CEO who's mainly focused on profit, who's saying, "What's in it for me?" Then, how do you sort of convince them that actually there is profit that comes from purpose? Then,
right. Great question, and it's funny, but I think we are at a point today where CEOs don't really need to be convinced. They're coming around and asking others like us, we want to get into this. We see the light. We have now realized that there is a different way that we need to be looking at our future by way of all of these things. The paradigm shift, if you like, from for-profit to purpose and then profit kind of thing. So I don't think they need much convincing today, But ask me this 10 years ago, when I first started getting interested in the subject of sustainability and discovered, and read up on a lot of material and educated myself about it. At that time, yes, you had to be an evangelist. It was tough. I have spoken to a few CEOs and board level people, and it was not an easy sell at all, which is why it didn't really get traction for the most part. I mean, there's some people who were listening and thinking to themselves, yeah, there is something here. We need to take it more seriously, what we're doing. But again, they were between the first and the second milestone, if you like. They were just moving into, corporate responsibility as a moral duty or an obligation, noblesse oblige, if you like. The industrial era version of an aristocratic, shall we say, morality, if I may call it that. I may be stretching it a bit in terms of, my metaphors, but I see it pretty much as that, that stage of development. But this is not about morality at all. This is about, hey, we've got to live here. We have only, as somebody says, there's no planet B, there's no plan B and there's no planet B that we can, the Elon Musks of the world, sorry to bring up his name again, they probably are preparing for a planet B, but that's only for, a certain segment of society who can afford it. What about the other, 7 billion people minus the 70 odd people who can afford to go to planet B? What happens to them? That's what it's about. It's not about morality at all, really. But you can link it with moral issues because the social justice part of it, even that is really about sustenance for us as a species, for us to coexist with other species, preserve the world. Basically a Gaian paradigm as opposed to where we've been coming from, which is a cornucopian paradigm. It's basically, everything is in abundance. You want to fish? Yeah, sure. The ocean is full of fish. Just go fish as much as you like. But today we know that over-harvesting is killing the ocean. It's killing marine life. It is completely changing the balance of how the ecology of the ocean works. It's a very complex subject. I mean, you touch one end, there are 15 other things that come along with it. It's, there's acidification, there's this, there's that. I have trouble even trying to build a taxonomy where I can categorize these things and say, I now have a framework wherein I can say, these are my slots, these are my categories, I understand what's happening. Because so many things are happening in the E part, in the S part, and the G part, not so much perhaps. That's where we come from. We've done consulting now for so many years. We understand businesses and what governance is all about. But the E and S part, for us guys, with our kind of history, unless you're an environmental engineer or a social scientist or a social justice warrior, these are new things we are learning. So long answer to your question, but there we are.
No, and I'm sure that we could keep talking all day, but we'll have to.
I definitely could. For me, this is so close to my heart that just ask me one question and I could just launch into an hour-long, passionate speech.
Well, we have to wrap it up as it's just a short podcast. But for anyone who's interested in learning more, I guess you've got the survey and other details on your website. Is that the best place to look?
It is the best place to look. And I'm happy to kind of share it if they would email me as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll make sure that we put your contact details on the show notes. So any listeners can just click on that and find all the details on how to reach you and how to get hold of the survey then, okay?
Absolutely, yes.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.